The millionaire's daughter hadn't spoken in months, until one day the girl whispers something to the housekeeper and the father breaks down. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Whitmore mansion stood like a monument to American success in the heart of Connecticut's Gold Coast. Its Georgian colonial facade commanding respect from behind wrought iron gates that bore the family crest. Built in 1923 by oil baron Theodore Whitmore Sr., the estate sprawled across 12 manicured acres in Greenwich, where old money whispered its secrets through perfectly pruned hedgerows and marble fountains imported from Tuscany. The morning sun cast long shadows across the circular driveway, where a black Tesla Model S sat silent, a modern touch that somehow felt out of place against the timeless grandeur of hand-carved limestone columns and leaded glass windows. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Richard Whitmore III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his mahogany-paneled study, watching his 8-year-old daughter Isabel through the bulletproof glass. She sat motionless on the marble steps leading to the garden, her small frame dwarfed by towering oak trees that had witnessed 4 generations of Whitmore triumphs and tragedies. Her blonde hair, the same shade as her late grandmother's, caught the September sunlight. But her blue eyes, once sparkling with childhood mischief, now stared at nothing with an emptiness that made Richard's chest tighten with familiar dread. 3 months. 3 months since that weekend at the family ranch in Montana, and not a single word had passed his daughter's lips. Mr. Whitmore? The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the 4th child psychologist they'd consulted since the incident. She stood in the doorway of his study, her designer briefcase clutched tightly in manicured hands that betrayed her nervousness, despite her reputation as one of Manhattan's most sought-after pediatric trauma specialists. At 52, Dr. Hendricks had built her career on breaking through to damaged children, but Isabel Whitmore had become her greatest challenge. "Well?" Richard's voice carried the same cold authority that had made him a legend on Wall Street. The same tone that had closed billion-dollar deals and destroyed competitors without blinking. But when it came to his daughter's silence, all his power meant nothing. Dr. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably, her grey suit impeccable, but her confidence shaken. "Mr. Whitmore, I've worked with selective mutism cases for over 2 decades, but Isabel, she's different. There's no fear in her eyes when she looks at me, no anxiety markers I'd typically expect. It's as if she's made a conscious choice to remain silent, and nothing I've tried has even begun to crack that shell." Richard turned from the window, his 6'2" frame imposing even in casual weekend attire, navy polo shirt and khakis that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His dark hair, graying at the temples, was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and his steel-grey eyes held the same calculating intensity that had earned him the nickname, the Predator, in Manhattan's real estate circles. But beneath that polished exterior, exhaustion carved deep lines around his eyes. "What about medication?" His voice was clipped, businesslike. "Surely there's something—" "Medication won't help with trauma-induced selective mutism, especially not without understanding the root cause," Dr. Hendricks interrupted, then immediately regretted her bold tone. "The Whitmores weren't people you interrupted. I mean, Mr. Whitmore, we need to know what happened at the ranch. The other children who were there that weekend, your nephew Tommy, your sister-in-law's children, they all seem fine. Whatever affected Isabel was specific to her experience." The mention of the ranch made Richard's jaw tighten. The Whitmore family's 30,000-acre spread in the Bitterroot Valley had been his grandfather's pride. A place where 3 generations had gathered for Labor Day weekends, filled with horseback riding, fly fishing, and the kind of bonding that was supposed to cement family legacies. This year's gathering had started no differently. 23 family members arriving on private jets, the staff preparing elaborate meals, children running wild across endless meadows under the watchful eye of nannies and protective parents. Then something had broken his daughter's voice, and nobody knew what, Dr. Hendricks, Richard said, moving to his desk, a massive piece of furniture carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that had belonged to his grandfather. I've hired the best private investigators in the country. I've reviewed every security camera, interviewed every staff member, analyzed every possible scenario. My daughter spent the weekend playing with her cousins, went to bed at reasonable hours, ate normal meals. There was no trauma, no accident, no incident that anyone witnessed. Sometimes trauma isn't about what we can see, Dr. Hendricks offered gently. Children process things differently. A conversation she overheard, something she saw that meant more to her than it would to an adult. My daughter is not fragile, Richard snapped, his control slipping for just a moment before he caught himself. The words hung in the air, hollow and defensive, because even he could hear how desperately he wanted them to be true. Through the study's open door, they could hear the soft click of high heels on marble. Victoria Whitmore entered with the grace of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being photographed at charity galas and society events. At 38, she was still breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of blonde, blue-eyed perfection that graced the covers of Town and Country and Architectural Digest. Her cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks spoke of understated elegance, but dark circles under her eyes betrayed the toll these months had taken. Dr. Hendricks, Victoria said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I hope Richard hasn't been too direct with you. He tends to treat our daughter's condition like a hostile takeover that can be solved with enough pressure and resources. The barb hit its mark. Richard's face darkened. But before he could respond, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the steely undertone that had helped her navigate Manhattan's social warfare for years. I canceled the Children's Hospital benefit last night, she said, not looking at her husband. The third major event this month. People are starting to ask questions, and I'm running out of excuses for why Isabel isn't attending family functions. Maybe, Richard said through clenched teeth, you should be more concerned about our daughter's well-being than your social calendar. Don't you dare, Victoria's composure cracked, her voice rising to a pitch that made Dr. Hendricks wish she was anywhere else. Don't you dare suggest I care more about appearances than Isabel. I'm the one who's been researching treatment options while you've been playing detective. I'm the one who sits with her for hours, reading stories to a child who won't respond. I'm the one holding this family together while you disappear into your office and pretend that throwing money at specialists will magically fix whatever's broken. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a landscaping crew was quietly trimming hedges, their presence a reminder that life continued its normal rhythm everywhere except within these walls. Dr. Hendricks cleared her throat, desperate to break the tension. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should focus on what might help Isabel feel safe enough to communicate again. Has she shown any preference for certain people? Any activities that seem to calm her? Victoria and Richard exchanged a look that spoke of months of accumulated frustration and blame. It was Victoria who answered, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She spends most of her time alone. The nannies say she's polite but distant. She eats when food is put in front of her, bathes when asked, goes to bed without protest. She's like a perfectly behaved ghost of herself. Victoria's voice broke on the last words, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as if trying to hold back a sob. Richard moved toward his wife instinctively, then stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. The gesture spoke volumes about the distance that had grown between them, how Isabel's silence had somehow silenced their marriage too. What about the previous housekeeper? Dr. Hendricks asked, consulting her notes. Mrs. Patterson, wasn't it? She left rather suddenly after the ranch weekend. Martha Patterson worked for us for 6 years, Richard said, his businessman's instincts taking over. Excellent references, spotless background check. She gave 2 weeks' notice the Monday after we returned from Montana. Said she had a family emergency in Arizona. We offered to help financially, but she declined. Nothing suspicious about it. But even as he said the words, something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Victoria caught it too, shooting him a sharp look that promised a private conversation later. Dr. Hendricks stood, recognizing the signs of a session that had reached its limit. "I'd like to recommend something different," she said. "Instead of focusing on getting Isabel to talk, what if we focused on creating an environment where she doesn't feel the pressure to perform? Sometimes children retreat into silence because they feel overwhelmed by expectations, even loving ones." "What are you suggesting?" Richard asked. "Give her space. Reduce the number of specialists coming through the house. Let her establish routines that feel safe. And perhaps most importantly, examine your own behaviors around her. Children are incredibly perceptive to adult anxiety. If she senses that her silence is causing family crisis, it might actually reinforce her need to stay quiet." Victoria looked stricken. "You're saying we're making it worse?" "Udi, I'm saying that healing happens in its own time," Dr. Hendricks said gently. "And sometimes the best thing we can do is create space for that healing to begin." As the doctor gathered her things and left, Richard and Victoria stood in their magnificent study, surrounded by first-edition books, oil paintings worth millions, and Persian rugs that had witnessed generations of family triumphs. None of it mattered. All their wealth, all their influence, all their carefully constructed perfection meant nothing when faced with one small girl's determined silence. Outside, Isabel still sat on the marble steps, watching a red cardinal build its nest in the ancient oak tree. She'd been sitting there for 2 hours, as still and silent as the marble statues that dotted the garden. In her small hands, she held a drawing she'd made, stick figures and crude shapes that might have been a house. Might have been a tree, might have been memories too frightening for 8-year-old words to hold. The silence in the Whitmore mansion wasn't empty. It was full of everything that couldn't be said, everything that couldn't be fixed with money or power, or the kind of love that came with conditions attached. And somewhere in that silence, a little girl who had once filled these halls with laughter and "Daddy, look at me," was learning that sometimes staying quiet was the only way to stay safe. The grandfather clock in the Whitmore Mansion's foyer chimed 11 times, each bronze note echoing through corridors that had once buzzed with Isabel's animated chatter about her day at Greenwich Academy's elementary division. Now, those same hallways absorbed sound like a tomb, swallowing footsteps and whispered conversations between staff members who moved through their duties with the careful reverence of people walking through a house of mourning. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the housekeeper, who had abruptly resigned, had been more than just domestic help. For 6 years, she had been the steady heartbeat of the Whitmore home, arriving each morning at 7 sharp, with her greying hair pinned in a perfect bun and her uniform pressed to crisp perfection. She had known exactly how Richard liked his coffee, black. 2 sugars served in the Wedgwood china his mother had given him. How Victoria preferred her morning smoothies, kale, spinach and pear, no banana, and most importantly, how Isabel liked her pancakes cut into perfect triangles with strawberries arranged in a smiley face. The new housekeeper, Maria Santos, had lasted exactly 3 weeks before submitting her resignation via text message. The one before her, Patricia Williams, had made it through a month and a half before citing irreconcilable differences with the position's emotional demands. Both had been excellent housekeepers with impeccable references, but neither had possessed the particular combination of patience, intuition, and quiet strength needed to work in a house where a child's silence had become the loudest sound in every room. Victoria sat in the morning room, mechanically stirring her untouched coffee while staring out at the garden where Isabel spent increasing amounts of time. The morning room had always been her sanctuary, decorated in soft yellows and whites, with French doors opening onto the terrace and antique furniture inherited from Richard's grandmother. But even this peaceful space felt heavy now, weighted down by conversations that never happened and questions that hung in the air without answers. Mrs. Whitmore. The voice belonged to James Morrison, the estate manager who had worked for the Whitmore family for 15 years. A tall, lean man in his 50s, with the kind of understated competence that made wealthy families sleep soundly at night. James handled everything from coordinating with landscapers to managing the complex security systems that protected the estate. But this morning, his usual calm demeanor seemed strained. "Yes, James?" Victoria looked up, noting the manila folder in his hands with a mixture of hope and dread. Any new information felt like a potential breakthrough, but 3 months of dead ends had taught her to temper her expectations. "I've been reviewing the employment records for the Montana ranch, as Mr. Whitmore requested," James said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful formality that marked all interactions between the Whitmore family and their staff. "I've found something that might be relevant." Victoria set down her coffee cup, the fine china making a delicate chime against its saucer. "What is it?" "Mrs. Patterson wasn't just our housekeeper that weekend. The ranch manager hired her for additional help during the family gathering. Apparently her sister lives in Missoula, so she was familiar with the area. She worked in the main lodge kitchen and helped coordinate meals for the 23 family members who attended." This was new information. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Why wasn't this mentioned before? According to the ranch manager, it was arranged informally. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned during a previous conversation that she was originally from Montana, and when they needed extra help for the Labor Day gathering, it seemed like a natural fit. "She flew out 2 days early to help with preparations." Victoria leaned forward. "So she was there before we arrived. She saw the setup, the staff preparations, maybe overheard conversations." Her voice trailed off as possibilities began forming in her mind. "There's more," James continued, consulting his notes. "The ranch's head chef, Maria Gonzalez, mentioned that Mrs. Patterson seemed unusually quiet during the weekend service. Not unfriendly, but distracted. And she left immediately after the Sunday brunch cleanup, didn't stay for the traditional staff dinner." The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation. Richard's voice carried through the foyer as he spoke to someone. His assistant, probably, given the clipped, professional tone. Victoria glanced at the antique mantel clock and frowned. It was barely 11:30. Richard never came home from his Manhattan office before 7, and usually much later. "James, could you give me a few minutes with my husband? But don't go far, I want him to hear this." Richard appeared in the doorway moments later, still wearing his charcoal Armani suit, but with his tie loosened and his usually perfect hair showing signs of stress-induced finger-running. At 42, he remained devastatingly handsome in the way that powerful men often were: sharp jawline, piercing grey eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms and charity galas alike. But 3 months of his daughter's silence had carved new lines around his eyes and added a tension to his shoulders that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. "Victoria," he said, nodding to James in acknowledgement, "I cancelled my afternoon meetings. The Carlisle deal can wait." The Carlisle deal was a $2 billion development project in Lower Manhattan that Richard had been orchestrating for 18 months. The fact that he was willing to postpone crucial negotiations spoke volumes about his state of mind. "Richard, James has found something about Mrs. Patterson." Victoria gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, pacing to the French doors, where he could see Isabel in the garden. She was sitting cross-legged beside the fountain, carefully arranging fallen autumn leaves in precise patterns. "Tell me," Richard said without turning around. James repeated his findings about Mrs. Patterson's dual role at the ranch, her unusual behavior and her hasty departure. As he spoke, Richard's reflection in the glass doors showed his expression growing increasingly focused, the same look he wore when analyzing a complex investment opportunity. "Have you contacted her?" Richard asked. "I tried. Her forwarding address in Arizona leads to a P.O. box. The phone number she left goes to voicemail, and she hasn't returned my calls." Richard turned from the window, his businessman's instincts fully engaged now. What about her sister in Missoula? Employment records must have emergency contacts. "That's the interesting part," James said. "According to the ranch manager, Mrs. Patterson mentioned having family in Montana, but there's no sister listed in her employment file with us. No Montana connections at all." A heavy silence settled over the morning room. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of leaf blowers as the landscaping crew worked to maintain the estate's autumn perfection. It was a normal sound, the kind of background noise that had filled their lives for years, but now it seemed to emphasize how abnormal everything had become. "She lied," Victoria said finally. "Why would she lie about having family in Montana?" "Maybe she didn't lie," Richard said slowly. "Maybe she had a different reason for being familiar with the area. James, I want you to hire a private investigator, not the one we used before, someone new. Someone who specializes in background investigations. I want to know everything about Martha Patterson, her real family connections, her financial situation, where she really went when she left us." Victoria watched her husband transform back into the ruthless businessman who had built an empire through sheer force of will and attention to detail. For months, their daughter's silence had made him feel powerless, but now he had something concrete to investigate, a puzzle to solve. It was both reassuring and terrifying to see him like this. "There's something else," Victoria said quietly. "Yesterday, I was going through Isabel's room, trying to organize some of her drawings, and I found something odd." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of construction paper covered in crayon marks. To most people, it would look like typical child's artwork, stick figures and geometric shapes in bright primary colors. But Victoria had studied it carefully, and patterns had begun to emerge. "This is the ranch," she said, pointing to a large rectangle drawn in brown crayon. "These are people. You can tell by the way she's drawn the heads and bodies. But look at this figure." She indicated a shape that seemed different from the others, darker, positioned away from the main group. "And this?" Her finger traced what might have been tears or rain falling from a smaller figure's face. Richard leaned closer, his analytical mind immediately engaged. "The crying figure is smaller, child-sized. That's what I thought. And this dark figure," Victoria hesitated, then continued, "I think it might be Mrs. Patterson. Look at the hair. It's pulled back just like she always wore it. And she's drawn apart from the family group like she's watching or hiding or being excluded," Richard added grimly. James cleared his throat carefully. "If I may, there's one more thing. The ranch manager mentioned that Mrs. Patterson asked specifically to work the children's meal service that weekend. Said she was good with kids and wanted to help in the dining room rather than just kitchen prep." Victoria felt a chill run through her. "She specifically requested to work around the children." Around our children," Richard corrected, his voice taking on the dangerous edge that Victoria recognized from his most high-stakes business negotiations. "James, I want that investigator contacted today. And I want security footage from every camera at the ranch, not just the public areas, but staff quarters, kitchen areas, everywhere. If something happened involving Mrs. Patterson and our daughter, I'm going to find out what it was." As if sensing the intensity of their conversation, Isabel looked up from her leaf arrangements and stared directly at the morning room windows. For a moment, her blue eyes seemed to focus on her parents with an awareness that was almost adult in its complexity. Then she returned to her leaves, carefully placing a bright red maple leaf at the center of her pattern. Victoria rose and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. "She knows we're talking about her," she murmured. "Sometimes I think she understands everything that's happening, but she's made a decision to stay on the outside of it all." "Children don't decide to traumatize themselves," Richard said firmly. "Something happened to her. Something specific, something frightening enough to make her retreat completely. And if Martha Patterson was involved, He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a threat. James stood, recognizing his dismissal. "I'll make the calls this afternoon. If there's anything to find about Mrs. Patterson, we'll find it." After he left, Victoria and Richard stood together at the French doors, watching their daughter create her careful patterns in the fallen leaves. The distance between husband and wife seemed as vast as the space between them and their silent child, all of them trapped in their own separate versions of the same nightmare. "What if we're wrong?" Victoria asked suddenly. What if it wasn't something that happened to her, but something she saw, something she wasn't supposed to witness? Richard's reflection in the glass showed his jaw tightening. Then someone in our family, someone we trust, has been lying to us for 3 months. The thought hung between them, cold and accusatory, as outside their daughter continued her solitary ritual of arranging autumn leaves with the precision of someone trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense at all. The private investigator's name was Sarah Chen, and she came highly recommended by the law firm that handled the Whitmore family's most sensitive legal matters. At 38, she had built her reputation on discretion and results, specializing in cases where wealthy families needed uncomfortable truths uncovered without media attention. Her office in downtown Greenwich was deliberately unremarkable. A converted Victorian house with cream-colored walls and generic landscape paintings that could have belonged to any small-town accountant or insurance broker. Richard sat across from her desk on a Tuesday morning, having driven himself in the Tesla rather than using his usual driver. Some conversations required absolute privacy. Sarah was smaller than he'd expected, with short black hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic appearance. But her handshake had been firm and her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, opening a manila folder thick with documents, "I've spent the past week investigating Martha Patterson's background, and what I've found is complicated." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "How complicated?" "Martha Patterson isn't her real name. She's actually Martha Patricia Kowalski, born in Buffalo, New York, 47 years ago. She legally changed her name 12 years ago after a bankruptcy and divorce that left her essentially homeless." Sarah spread several documents across her desk: court filings, employment records, and what appeared to be police reports. She worked as a domestic for several wealthy families on Long Island before coming to Greenwich. Always excellent references, always left on good terms. But there's a pattern that's interesting. "What kind of pattern?" "Dacia. She tends to work for families with young children, and she tends to leave shortly after significant family events, weddings, major holidays, family reunions, sometimes within days of large gatherings." Richard felt his chest tighten. "Are you suggesting she's some kind of predator?" "No, nothing like that. Her background checks are clean, no criminal history, no complaints from previous employers about inappropriate behavior with children. But—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think she might be what we call a professional secret keeper." "Meaning?" Wealthy families aren't always as perfect as they appear, Mr. Whitmore. During large gatherings, people drink too much, say things they shouldn't, make mistakes they'd rather forget. Someone in Martha's position, trusted staff who moves through houses like furniture, essentially invisible, she sees things. And I believe she's learned to monetize that knowledge. The implication hit Richard like a physical blow. "You're saying she was blackmailing us?" Not necessarily, but possibly selling information. I found evidence of several cash deposits in her bank account over the past 6 years, always within weeks of leaving a position, always for amounts that suggest payment for services beyond housekeeping." Sarah pulled out a bank statement highlighted in yellow. "The most recent deposit was made 4 days after she left your employment. $15,000 cash deposited at a branch in Hartford." Richard stared at the paper, his businessman's mind racing through possibilities. "Who paid her?" "That's where it gets interesting. The deposit was made during business hours on a Thursday, but the bank's security cameras show Martha Patterson wasn't the one who made it. The person who deposited the money was a woman in her 70s, well-dressed, driving a black Mercedes with Connecticut plates. The description sent ice through Richard's veins. Did you get the license plate? Partial. But combined with the physical description and the timing, Sarah met his eyes directly. Mr. Whitmore, I think your mother paid Martha Patterson to disappear. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Richard's relationship with his mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had always been complex. She was the iron-willed matriarch who had helped build the family empire, but who also believed that family image was more important than individual happiness. At 74, she remained sharp as a blade and twice as cutting when she perceived threats to the Whitmore legacy. That's impossible, Richard said, but even as he spoke, doubts crept in. My mother wasn't even at the ranch until Saturday. She flew in from the Hamptons. Actually, according to flight records, she arrived in Montana on Thursday. The same day Martha Patterson flew out early to help with preparations. They were both at the ranch for 2 full days before the rest of the family arrived. Richard felt the world shifting beneath him. His mother had told him she was spending the week at their summer house in East Hampton, handling some business with her art collection. She'd mentioned arriving at the ranch on Saturday, just in time for the traditional family dinner. But if she'd been there since Thursday, what else? Richard asked grimly. Sarah consulted her notes. I spoke with the ranch's head of security, discreetly, as a routine follow-up to your previous investigation. He mentioned something interesting. On Friday night, before the family gathering officially began, he was called to investigate a disturbance in the main lodge. Raised voices from the private dining room around 10 o'clock. Who was involved? He didn't specify names, but he said it was family members discussing family business and that he was told to ignore it. His exact words were that Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore asked him to ensure privacy for a sensitive family discussion. Richard's hands clenched into fists. A sensitive family discussion at the ranch, before the official gathering, involving his mother and, apparently, Martha Patterson. I need to see the ranch's employment records for that weekend, Richard said. Every staff member, every contractor, every person who had access to the property. Already done. Sarah handed him another folder. This is where it gets personal, Mr. Whitmore. Your mother specifically requested that Martha Patterson handle food service for the children's meals that weekend. She also requested that the regular nanny staff be given the weekend off, said family members would supervise the children. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture that Richard didn't want to see. His mother arriving early, Martha Patterson, working directly with the children under his mother's supervision. A heated argument on Friday night, and then 3 days later, his daughter's voice disappearing forever. There's one more thing, Sarah said quietly. I managed to track down Martha Patterson. She's not in Arizona. She's living in a retirement community in Sarasota, Florida, one of those upscale places that costs about $8,000 a month. For someone who was recently bankrupt, she's living remarkably well. Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Greenwich's affluent downtown. I need her address. Mr. Whitmore, I should warn you, approaching her directly could backfire. If she was paid to keep quiet about something, confronting her might make her disappear entirely. Or worse, if there's something she knows that could damage your family. And pushing too hard might... My daughter hasn't spoken in 3 months, Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the cold fury that had made him legendary in business negotiations. Whatever Martha Patterson knows, whatever my mother paid her to hide, it's eating my child alive from the inside. I don't care about family reputation or damage control. I care about getting Isabel's voice back. Sarah nodded slowly. I'll make contact first, gently, see if she's willing to talk. But Mr. Whitmore, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that what she knows might be something you wish you'd never learned. That evening, Richard sat in his study staring at the phone. Eleanor Whitmore's number highlighted on the screen. Outside, October rain pelted the windows with increasing intensity. And somewhere in the house, Victoria was reading aloud to Isabel, a nightly ritual that continued despite their daughter's silence. Victoria's voice carrying through the halls like a prayer to a god who might not be listening. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times before Richard finally made the call. "Richard, oh darling," his mother's voice was as crisp and commanding as always. "How lovely to hear from you. Though rather late for a social call. Mother, we need to talk about Martha Patterson." The silence that followed was telling. When Eleanor finally spoke, her tone had shifted from warm to carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, dear. I mean the $15,000 you paid her to disappear. I mean the private conversation you had with her at the ranch before the family gathering. I mean whatever happened that weekend that made my daughter stop speaking." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Richard could hear classical music. Vivaldi probably. His mother had always favored the Baroque composers. Finally she sighed, a sound that carried decades of carefully maintained family secrets. "Richard, some conversations are better had in person. Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" "I'm free right now, Mother. Tonight, this can't wait." "Very well." Her voice was resigned but still controlled. "But not at your house. Victoria doesn't need to hear this, and certainly not Isabel. Meet me at the club in an hour." The Greenwich Country Club was nearly empty at 10 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night. But Eleanor Whitmore had the kind of influence that opened doors regardless of official hours. She sat in the club's private dining room, a brandy snifter in her manicured hands and steel in her blue eyes that was so much like Isabel's. At 74, Eleanor remained formidable. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, designer suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of posture that spoke of decades of social warfare in Manhattan's most exclusive circles. But tonight, she looked tired in a way Richard had never seen before. "Sit down, Richard," she said without preamble, "and prepare yourself to learn something about your wife that you're not going to like." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What about Victoria?" Eleanor took a careful sip of brandy before answering. "That weekend at the ranch, Martha Patterson witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Something that could have destroyed your marriage, damaged Isabel permanently, and ruined everything your father and I built for this family." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "What did she see?" She saw Victoria with someone she shouldn't have been with. In a way she shouldn't have been. And your daughter, your beautiful, innocent daughter, saw it too. The rain outside seemed to intensify, drumming against the club's windows like accusations. Richard stared at his mother, trying to process words that seemed to rearrange everything he thought he knew about his life. "That's impossible. Victoria would never, wouldn't she?" Eleanor's voice was gentle but relentless. "A woman who married young, who gave up her dreams for family expectations, who spent 15 years playing the perfect wife while watching her own identity disappear. A woman who's been seeing a therapist for 2 years. Yes, I know about Dr. Martinez, because she feels trapped in a life she never really chose." Richard felt physically sick. Who does it matter? The point is, Isabel saw something that confused and frightened her. A child that age doesn't understand adult complications, but she understands betrayal. She understands when the foundation of her world cracks. "So you paid Martha Patterson to keep quiet and disappear?" "I paid Martha Patterson to protect this family," Eleanor said firmly. "To protect Isabel from becoming the center of a scandal that would have destroyed her parents' marriage and her own sense of security." "Sometimes, Richard, love means making difficult choices." Richard stood slowly, his legs unsteady. "You let my daughter suffer in silence for 3 months to protect our reputation." "I let your daughter heal in privacy rather than become tabloid fodder for Manhattan's gossip mill," Eleanor corrected. "But clearly, the silence has become its own problem. What exactly did Isabel see?" Eleanor's composure finally cracked slightly. Enough to understand that her mother was unhappy, enough to worry that families could break apart, enough to make her afraid that speaking might somehow make the breaking worse. The truth settled over Richard like a suffocating blanket. His daughter's silence wasn't about trauma, it was about protection. She was protecting her family by protecting the secret she'd witnessed. And in her 8-year-old understanding of the world, staying quiet was the only way to keep everyone safe. "I need to talk to Victoria," Richard said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed quietly. "You do, but Richard, remember that your daughter is watching how you both handle this. Whatever anger you feel, whatever hurt this causes, she needs to see that families can face truth and survive it." Richard left the club without another word, driving home through rain that seemed to wash the certainty out of everything he'd believed about his life. Tomorrow, he would have to confront his wife about a betrayal that had broken their daughter's voice. Tonight, he had to figure out how to be the father Isabel needed, strong enough to face the truth, gentle enough to help her find her way back to speaking, and wise enough to rebuild a family that had been cracking long before anyone noticed the silence. The drive home from the Greenwich Country Club felt endless, each streetlight illuminating Richard's hands, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The rain had intensified into a proper October storm, the kind that stripped leaves from trees and sent them skittering across empty roads like secrets trying to escape. By the time he pulled into the circular driveway, it was nearly midnight, and the Whitmore mansion stood dark, except for a single light glowing in Victoria's bedroom window. Richard sat in the Tesla for 10 minutes, staring up at that light and trying to reconcile the woman he'd married 15 years ago with the stranger his mother had described. Victoria Whitmore, née Victoria Elizabeth Sinclair, had been 23 when they met at a charity auction in Manhattan, fresh out of Vassar, with a degree in art history and dreams of working at the Metropolitan Museum. She'd been bidding on a small Degas sketch, determined but clearly outmatched by collectors with deeper pockets. And something about her fierce concentration had caught his attention. He'd outbid everyone for the Degas and then, in a gesture that had felt romantic at the time, given it to her. She'd protested, of course, said she couldn't accept such an expensive gift from a stranger, but he'd worn down her resistance with the kind of persistent charm that had served him well in business. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of gallery openings, intimate dinners at restaurants that required months-long reservations, and weekend trips to his family's various properties. Looking back now, Richard wondered if he'd been so focused on winning her that he'd never stopped to ask if she truly wanted to be won. The front door opened as he approached, and Victoria stood silhouetted in the foyer's soft lighting. She was wearing a cream-colored silk robe over matching pajamas, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. For a moment, seeing her like this, Richard felt the familiar surge of protective affection that had defined their early marriage. Then he remembered his mother's words, and his chest tightened with betrayal and dread. "Richard." Victoria's voice carried concern and confusion. "I wasn't expecting you back tonight. When James said you'd cancelled your meetings, I thought you were working late on the Patterson investigation." He stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket while studying his wife's face for signs of deception. But Victoria had always been skilled at maintaining composure. It was one of the qualities that made her such an asset at charity functions and business dinners. Her blue eyes showed only genuine worry and the kind of exhaustion that had become their constant companion since Isabel's silence began. "We need to talk," Richard said, hanging his jacket in the front closet with deliberate care. "About the ranch. About what really happened that weekend." Something flickered across Victoria's expression, too quick to interpret, but definitely there. "Of course. Do you want to go to your study? I can make coffee." "No coffee, and not my study." Richard's voice was carefully controlled, but Victoria knew him well enough to recognize the dangerous quiet that preceded his most devastating business negotiations. The morning room. Neutral territory. They walked through their mansion's corridors in silence, past family portraits and priceless antiques that suddenly felt like evidence of a life built on careful appearances rather than authentic connection. The morning room, with its soft yellow walls and French doors leading to the garden, had always been Victoria's favorite space in the house. Now it felt like a courtroom where their marriage was about to be tried. Victoria settled into her usual chair, cream-colored upholstery that complemented the room's gentle palette, while Richard remained standing by the windows. Outside, the storm had reached its peak, rain lashing against the glass with enough force to rattle the frames. Lightning illuminated the garden in stark black and white, revealing the fountain where Isabel spent so many silent hours. "I hired a private investigator to look into Martha Patterson's background," Richard began, his back still turned to his wife. "What I found was interesting. $15,000 deposited into her account 4 days after she left us. Deposited by my mother." He heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath, but didn't turn around. "The investigator also discovered that my mother arrived at the ranch on Thursday, not Saturday, as she told us. She was there for 2 full days before the official family gathering, along with Martha Patterson. And on Friday night, there was some kind of heated discussion in the main lodge that required security to ensure privacy." "Richard." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "I confronted my mother tonight." Now he did turn around, his grey eyes studying Victoria's face with the intensity he usually reserved for analysing hostile takeover bids. "She told me that Martha Patterson witnessed something at the ranch. Something involving you. Something that Isabel saw too." Victoria's composure finally cracked. Her face went pale, and her hands began trembling in her lap. For a long moment, the only sound was rain against windows and the distant ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice thick with tears that hadn't yet fallen. "Richard, please let me explain." "Then explain." His voice was deadly quiet. "Explain why our daughter stopped speaking. Explain why my mother paid our housekeeper $15,000 to disappear. Explain what you did that was bad enough to traumatize an 8-year-old into silence." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the French doors, where she pressed her palms against the glass, as if trying to escape through sheer force of will. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that Richard had to strain to hear her over the storm. "Do you remember our anniversary dinner last year? At Le Bernardin?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Richard nodded grimly. "You seemed distracted, sad." "I was sad. I was drowning, Richard, and I didn't know how to tell you." Victoria turned to face him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Do you know what I was thinking about during that dinner? I was thinking about the Degas sketch you bought me the night we met. How I'd wanted it so badly, not because it was valuable, but because it represented something I was passionate about. Art, beauty, the kind of work that feeds your soul." "Victoria, what does this have to do with everything?" Her voice rose, years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "It has everything to do with what happened at the ranch, with what Isabel saw, with why our daughter can't bear to speak in this house anymore." She moved to the antique writing desk, where she kept her personal correspondence, pulling out a folder that Richard had never seen before. Inside were photographs, sketches, and what appeared to be acceptance letters from various institutions. 3 years ago, I applied to the graduate program at Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage," Victoria said, her voice steadying as she found her courage. "I got in, Richard. Full scholarship. They wanted me to study the restoration of medieval manuscripts. It was everything I dreamed about when I was 23 and bidding on that Degas." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You never mentioned applying to graduate school, because you never would have understood. Your wife doesn't need a career, Richard. Your wife has charity work and social obligations and the privilege of being Mrs. Richard Whitmore III. When the acceptance letter came, I stared at it for 3 hours before putting it away. I never even responded. But what does this have to do with Daniel Martinez? The name came out like a confession. Professor Daniel Martinez from Yale's art history department. He was the one who encouraged me to apply, who believed in my work. And yes, I've been meeting with him for the past 2 years. Not for therapy, despite what your mother thinks. For mentoring. For guidance about a life I was too afraid to pursue. Richard felt the ground shifting beneath him again, but not in the direction he'd expected. The man my mother saw you with at the ranch? Daniel was attending a conference in Montana that weekend. When I found out, I asked him to meet me. I needed to talk to someone who understood the choice I was facing, the choice between the life I was living and the life I'd always wanted. What choice? Victoria's tears fell harder now, but her voice remained steady. Whether to leave you, Richard. Whether to take Isabel and start over somewhere I could be myself instead of just an extension of your success. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He sank into the chair Victoria had vacated, his legs suddenly unable to support him. You were planning to leave us? I was planning to save myself, Victoria corrected. Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up every morning in a life that feels like an expensive prison? To love your daughter desperately, but know that she's watching you disappear a little more each day? To be married to a man who sees you as an asset rather than a partner? That's not true. I love you. You love the idea of me, Victoria interrupted. You love the way I look at charity galas, the way I manage your social calendar, the way I make your life run smoothly. But when was the last time you asked me what I wanted? What I dreamed about? What made me happy? Richard opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The question hung in the air, demanding an honest answer he wasn't prepared to give. At the ranch, Victoria continued, I met Daniel at the old oak grove, away from the family gathering. We talked for maybe an hour about whether I had the courage to choose authenticity over security. He held my hand while I cried about feeling trapped. He kissed my forehead when I said I was afraid of breaking up our family. And apparently Isabel saw that moment and interpreted it as her mother choosing a stranger over her father. An hour, Richard repeated numbly. You've been meeting with another man for 2 years, and my mother made it sound like you were having an affair. Your mother saw what she expected to see. A wealthy wife stepping out of line, threatening family stability. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about control. Victoria's voice took on a bitter edge. She confronted me that Friday night. Threatened to tell you that I was having an affair unless I ended my inappropriate relationship with Daniel and focused on being a proper Whitmore wife. And you agreed? I panicked. I told her I would never see Daniel again, that I would give up any thoughts of graduate school or a career outside this family. I promised to be the perfect wife you married, even if it killed me inside. Richard felt sick. But Isabel heard this conversation? Worse, she saw me afterwards crying in the ranch's library. She asked me what was wrong, and God, Richard, I was so broken in that moment. I told her that sometimes mommies and daddies have to make hard choices, that sometimes people have to give up things they love to keep their families together. I said I was scared that if I pursued my own dreams, I might have to go away, and then who would take care of her? The full horror of the situation finally became clear. Isabel, at 8 years old, had witnessed what appeared to be her mother's emotional betrayal of her father. Then she'd heard her mother talking about leaving, about making impossible choices between personal happiness and family loyalty. To a child's understanding, speaking up about what she'd seen might trigger the family destruction her mother was trying to prevent. She's been protecting us, Richard said hoarsely. By staying silent, she thinks she's keeping our marriage together. And the awful thing is, she's right. Victoria sank back into her chair, emotionally drained. If your mother had told you her version of events 3 months ago, you would have divorced me without hesitation. You would have fought for custody, hired the best lawyers, destroyed my reputation. Isabel knows, somehow, that her silence is the only thing standing between us and complete family annihilation. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but inside the morning room, Richard and Victoria sat in the wreckage of 15 years of marriage, built on assumptions neither had examined too closely. Their daughter's silence suddenly made perfect sense, and that understanding made it even more heartbreaking. "What happens now?" Richard asked finally. Victoria wiped her eyes, studying her husband's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "That depends on you. Do you want to fight for this marriage, or do you want to end it? Because if we're going to help Isabel find her voice again, we need to show her that telling the truth doesn't destroy families, it saves them. The choice hung between them like a bridge. They would either cross together or watch burn." And somewhere upstairs, their daughter slept her careful, silent sleep, still protecting secrets that were slowly killing them all. The morning after the storm brought an October sky so clear and blue it seemed almost artificial, as if nature were overcompensating for the previous night's violence. Richard stood at his bedroom window watching the landscaping crew clean up fallen branches and scattered leaves, their efficient movements a stark contrast to the chaos inside his own mind. He had slept perhaps 2 hours, lying rigid beside Victoria in their king-sized bed, both of them maintaining the careful space that had become routine even before last night's revelations. Victoria had risen early, as she always did, but instead of her usual routine of checking emails and planning the day's activities, she had gone directly to Isabel's room. Richard could hear her voice through the walls, soft, patient, reading from what sounded like Charlotte's Web, a book Isabel had loved before the silence began. The normalcy of it felt surreal, given everything that had been exposed between them. By 8 o'clock, Richard had made a decision that went against every instinct honed by decades of business success. Instead of trying to control the situation, instead of crafting a strategy to manage the crisis, he was going to tell the truth. All of it, starting with their daughter. He found Victoria and Isabel in the breakfast nook, a sun-filled alcove overlooking the garden where they had shared thousands of morning meals as a family. Isabel sat cross-legged in her chair, wearing purple pajamas with unicorns, methodically eating pieces of toast cut into triangles, the same way Martha Patterson used to prepare them. Victoria had barely touched her coffee, her attention focused entirely on their daughter, with an intensity that spoke of both love and desperation. "Good morning, sweetheart," Richard said, settling into the chair across from Isabel. She looked up at him with those penetrating blue eyes, acknowledging his presence with a small nod before returning to her toast. The silence that followed felt different somehow, less oppressive, more expectant, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Isabel," Richard continued, his voice gentler than Victoria had heard it in months. "Mommy and I need to talk to you about something important, about what happened at the ranch." Victoria's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. They hadn't discussed this approach. Richard was improvising, following instincts that contradicted everything his mother had taught him about protecting family secrets. Isabel's chewing slowed, her small hands stilling on her toast. She didn't look up, but Richard could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become more deliberate. "We know you saw something that scared you," Richard said, moving his chair closer to his daughter's, "something that made you worry about our family. And we think you've been staying quiet because you're trying to protect everyone." Now, Isabel did look up, her eyes wide with something that might have been relief or terror, or both. Victoria reached across the table and gently covered their daughter's small hand with her own. "Baby," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to protect us. That's not your job. Your job is to be 8 years old and ask questions and make noise and tell us when you're scared or confused or angry." For a moment, Richard thought Isabel might speak. Her lips parted slightly, and she leaned forward as if preparing to share the weight she'd been carrying. But then the moment passed, and she returned to her toast with renewed focus. building a small fortress of crust around her plate's edges. The morning routine continued around them, James Morrison arriving to discuss estate management, the housekeeper service sending a new candidate for interview, delivery trucks bringing weekly groceries and fresh flowers. But underneath the familiar rhythms, something fundamental had shifted. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a door that might eventually open. At 10 o'clock, Richard made another unprecedented decision. He cancelled his afternoon meetings and asked Victoria to do the same with her charity committee obligations. If they were going to rebuild their family, they needed to start by actually being present for it. "I want to take Isabel somewhere today," he said, as Victoria finished her phone calls. "Somewhere away from this house, away from all the pressure and expectations." Victoria looked surprised. "Where?" "The old Sinclair farm." "Your grandfather's property in Vermont." The suggestion caught Victoria completely off guard. The Sinclair farm had been her refuge as a child. 200 acres of rolling hills and maple forests that her grandfather had maintained as a working dairy operation until his death 10 years earlier. Victoria had inherited the property but visited rarely, finding it too painful to see the place where she'd been happiest slowly returning to wilderness. "Richard, the farmhouse hasn't been occupied in years. There's no electricity, no running water." "Exactly. No distractions. No staff, no schedule. Just us." He paused, studying his wife's face. "When was the last time Isabel saw you truly happy? Not performing happiness for social functions or charity events, but genuinely content." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she understood. "You think she needs to see me choose something for myself? Choose to go back to a place that mattered to me before I became Mrs. Richard Whitmore. I think she needs to see us both choose our family over everything else. And maybe," Richard's voice grew rough with emotion, "maybe I need to see the woman I fell in love with, before I turned her into someone she never wanted to be." The drive to Vermont took 3 hours in Richard's Range Rover, loaded with camping supplies hastily purchased from an outdoor gear store in Greenwich. Isabel sat in the back seat, coloring in a sketchbook Victoria had given her, occasionally glancing up to watch the landscape change from Connecticut suburbs to Vermont farmland. She still hadn't spoken, but something in her posture seemed less guarded. Victoria navigated the final miles down increasingly rural roads, pointing out landmarks from her childhood. The covered bridge where she'd caught her first trout, the maple grove where her grandmother had taught her to identify birds by their songs, the old stone walls that marked property boundaries established before the Revolutionary War. The Sinclair farmhouse stood at the end of a gravel road, weathered but still solid after a century and a half of Vermont winters. White clapboard siding had faded to grey in places, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly, but the stone foundation remained steady, and the slate roof showed no signs of compromise. Behind the house, the red barn listed gently to one side, its paint peeling but its frames still strong. "Oh," Victoria whispered as they parked beside the old maple tree where her grandfather used to hang a tire swing. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is here." Richard watched his wife's face transform as memories flooded back. The careful mask she'd worn for so many years dissolved, replaced by something authentic and unguarded. This was the woman who had bid so fiercely on that Degas sketch 15 years ago. Passionate, determined, alive with possibility. Isabel climbed out of the car and stood very still, taking in the vast sky and rolling meadows that stretched beyond the farmhouse. After months of carefully manicured estates and controlled environments, the wild beauty of abandoned Vermont farmland seemed to catch her off guard. She walked slowly toward the barn, her small figure dwarfed by the landscape, but somehow more substantial than she'd appeared in weeks. "The key should still be under the third porch board," Victoria said, leading them toward the house. "Grandpa never believed in changing traditions that worked." The farmhouse interior smelled of old wood and lavender. Sachets Victoria's grandmother had made decades earlier still perfumed the air. Dusty furniture covered in white sheets gave the rooms a ghostly quality. But afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows revealed hardwood floors and simple, well-made furnishings that spoke of generations who had valued substance over style. Richard found himself studying the family photographs that lined the mantel, pictures of Victoria as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, arms around farm animals and covered in mud from adventures in the woods. In these images, she looked nothing like the polished society wife she'd become. She looked free. "I spent every summer here until I was 18, Victoria said, settling into her grandmother's rocking chair as if 15 years hadn't passed. "Grandpa let me help with the dairy cows, and Grandma taught me to can vegetables and preserve flowers. I thought I'd bring my own children here someday, teach them the things I'd learned." "Why didn't you?" Richard asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Because Mrs. Richard Whitmore doesn't spend summers at rundown farms in Vermont. She spends summers in the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard, at places where social connections can be maintained and business opportunities cultivated." Victoria's voice held no bitterness, just sadness for choices made and unmade. Isabel appeared in the doorway carrying something, a wooden box she'd found somewhere in the house. She set it carefully on the coffee table and looked expectantly at her mother. Victoria opened it with trembling hands, revealing childhood treasures she'd forgotten: pressed flowers, smooth stones from the farm's creek, a bird's nest, and dozens of small drawings she'd made during those long-ago summers. "I was about your age when I started this collection," Victoria told Isabel, pulling out a sketch of the barn. "Every time I found something beautiful, I kept it to remember." For the first time in months, Isabel smiled, a small, tentative expression but genuine. She reached into the box and carefully selected a pressed violet, holding it up to catch the afternoon light filtering through the window. "Purple was always my favorite color too," Victoria continued. "Grandma said it was the color of courage, bright enough to be noticed, deep enough to last." Richard watched this exchange, feeling like an intruder in his own family, but also like he was seeing them clearly for the first time. Without the trappings of wealth and social position, without staff and schedules and expectations, they were just three people trying to find their way back to each other. As the afternoon wore on, they explored the property together. Victoria showed Isabel the secret fort she'd built in the barn's hayloft, and Richard found himself actually lying in tall grass, pointing out cloud shapes instead of checking his phone for urgent emails. When evening approached, they made a fire in the farmhouse's old stone fireplace and cooked hot dogs on improvised skewers, eating by firelight like campers. It was then, in the dancing shadows of the farmhouse living room, that Isabel finally spoke, not words, but a sound. A small laugh as Richard struggled with his burned hot dog. The sound was so unexpected, so precious after months of silence, that both parents froze. Afraid to breathe and break the spell, Isabel looked up at them, her face lit by firelight, and for the first time in 3 months, she looked like a child instead of a guardian of terrible secrets. "More," she whispered, so quietly they almost missed it. "More what, sweetheart?" Victoria asked gently. Isabel pointed at her father's comically charred hot dog and whispered again, "More fire. For Daddy." It was the first time she'd called him Daddy since the ranch. Richard's eyes filled with tears as he obediently held another hot dog over the flames, burning it deliberately, while Isabel watched with something that might have been the beginning of joy. Outside, Vermont darkness settled over the old farm, but inside the candlelit farmhouse, a family was slowly remembering how to be together without performing for anyone but themselves. It was only 2 words, but they were a beginning. And sometimes, Richard thought, as he watched his daughter and wife laugh together in the firelight, beginnings were more precious than endings. The new housekeeper arrived on a grey November morning that carried the promise of winter in its sharp wind. Rosa May Johnson stepped out of a weathered Honda Civic that looked decidedly out of place in the Whitmore estate's circular driveway. Her presence as different from Martha Patterson as magnolia blossoms from hothouse orchids. Where Martha had been precise and invisible, Rosa commanded attention simply by existing. A woman in her early 50s with rich mahogany skin, silver-streaked hair twisted into a practical bun, and the kind of substantial build that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. Victoria watched from the morning room window as Rosa surveyed the mansion's imposing facade, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the calm assessment of someone who had learned to read houses and the families who lived in them. There was something unhurried about her movements, a deliberate grace that suggested she moved through the world at her own pace, regardless of external pressure. "She's not what I expected," Victoria murmured to Richard, who was reviewing Rosa's employment file one final time. The domestic agency had been apologetic about the limited options. Apparently, word had spread through Greenwich's tight-knit service community about the Whitmore family's situation. Rosa Johnson had been the only candidate willing to take a position in a house where an 8-year-old girl hadn't spoken in 4 months. "Her references are impeccable," Richard said, though his tone suggested he shared Victoria's uncertainty. 23 years with the Morrison family in Savannah, 15 years before that with a family in Charleston. No complaints, excellent recommendations, and she specifically requested to work with families who had children. Rosa's background was as different from Martha Patterson's as the Deep South from New England. Born in rural Georgia, the youngest of 6 children raised by a grandmother who had been a midwife and folk healer, Rosa had learned early that healing came in many forms, sometimes through medicine, sometimes through food, and sometimes through the simple act of bearing witness to another person's pain without trying to fix it. The front door chimed as James Morrison escorted Rosa inside for the formal introduction. She moved through the marble foyer with neither intimidation nor false confidence, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the Italian stone as she took in the oil paintings and crystal chandeliers that announced the family's wealth to anyone who entered. "Mrs. Johnson," Victoria said, extending her hand in the formal manner she'd perfected for charity functions. "Thank you for coming. I hope the drive from the city wasn't too difficult." Rosa's handshake was firm and warm, her calloused fingers speaking of decades spent caring for other people's homes and families. "Please call me Rosa," she said, her voice carrying the soft cadences of coastal Georgia. "And the drive was just fine. Gave me time to think about how I want to approach this situation." There was something in the way she said situation that made both Victoria and Richard look at her more carefully. This wasn't a woman who would pretend that everything in the Whitmore house was normal, or who would tiptoe around the elephant in the room. "Rosa," Richard said, his businessman's instincts engaged, "I want to be clear about what you're walking into. Our daughter Isabel has been selectively mute for 4 months. She's seen numerous specialists, and while she's physically healthy, she's chosen not to speak. It's been challenging for the household staff." Rosa nodded slowly, her dark eyes studying Richard's face with an intensity that was somehow both respectful and penetrating. "Mr. Whitmore, children don't stop talking without reason. Usually, they're trying to tell us something important, and silence is the only language they think we'll understand." The observation was so direct, so uncomfortably accurate, that Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure falter. "Rosa, I should mention that Isabel can be withdrawn. She may not warm up to you immediately." "That's all right," Rosa said simply. "Some of the most important conversations happen without words. If that child needs time to figure out whether I'm safe, I'm happy to give her that time." Something about Rosa's calm confidence in the face of their family crisis felt like cool water on a burn. Victoria realized that for months, every interaction with domestic staff had been charged with tension and defensiveness, as if Isabel's silence were a reflection of their failure as parents. Rosa seemed to understand that the silence itself wasn't the problem. It was a symptom of something deeper that required patience rather than pressure to heal. "Would you like to meet Isabel now?" Victoria asked, surprised to find herself genuinely curious about how this encounter would unfold. "I'd like to see her," Rosa corrected gently. "Meeting happens when both people are ready for it. For now, I'll just let her see me, let her figure out what kind of person I am." They found Isabel in her favorite spot by the fountain, wearing a heavy sweater against the November chill and arranging fallen leaves in increasingly complex patterns. She looked up as they approached, her blue eyes immediately focusing on Rosa with the careful assessment she'd developed since the ranch incident. Rosa stopped a respectful distance away, not trying to invade Isabel's space or force interaction. Instead, she looked around the garden with genuine appreciation, taking in the carefully maintained flower beds and the ancient oak trees that had stood guard over the property for generations. "This is a beautiful place," Rosa said, speaking to Victoria but making sure her voice carried to Isabel. "That oak tree there, it's got to be 100 years old at least. I bet it's seen a lot of families grow up in this house." Isabel's hands stilled on her leaves, though she didn't look directly at Rosa. "My grandmother always said old trees like that are good listeners," Rosa continued, settling onto a nearby bench as if she had all the time in the world. "They've heard so many stories, they don't judge the new ones. Just stand there steady, letting people figure things out in their own time." It was such a subtle approach that Richard almost missed its brilliance. Rosa wasn't trying to engage Isabel directly or convince her to respond. She was simply creating a space where interaction might happen naturally, without pressure or expectation. "Rosa will be helping us around the house," Victoria explained to Isabel, following the older woman's lead by keeping her tone casual and unthreatening. "She's from Georgia, where they grow the most beautiful peach trees. Peach trees and magnolias," Rosa agreed. "And the best sweet tea in the world, though I suspect that might be too much sugar for Connecticut tastes." She smiled as she said it, a warm expression that reached her eyes and made even Richard feel oddly comforted. Isabel returned to her leaf patterns, but Richard noticed that she positioned herself slightly closer to where Rosa sat, as if drawn to the woman's calm presence despite her caution. Over the following days, Rosa moved through the Whitmore house like a gentle force of nature, establishing routines that somehow felt less regimented than restorative. She arrived each morning at 7:30, always carrying a worn leather bag that seemed to contain an endless supply of practical items: herbal tea sachets, small tools for minor repairs, and occasionally treats that appeared as if by magic when they were most needed. Unlike Martha Patterson, who had moved through the house with efficient invisibility, Rosa worked with a quiet presence that filled spaces without dominating them. She hummed while she cleaned, old spirituals and folk songs that seemed to emanate from some deep well of contentment. The melodies drifted through the mansion's halls, adding warmth to rooms that had felt increasingly cold and sterile. Most remarkably, Rosa never tried to make Isabel talk. When she encountered the child during her daily routines, she would simply acknowledge her presence with a gentle, "Good morning, Miss Isabel," or "How are those leaves treating you today?" She never waited for responses or showed disappointment when none came. Instead, she would share small observations about her work, the weather, or stories from her own childhood that seemed crafted to entertain without demanding engagement. "When I was about your age," Rosa said one afternoon while polishing furniture in the living room where Isabel was reading, "my grandmother taught me that some plants need to be talked to if you want them to grow. But others prefer quiet company. They do their growing when nobody's watching, and too much attention makes them shy." Isabel looked up from her book, making brief eye contact before returning to the pages. But Rosa caught the moment of connection and filed it away as progress. The real breakthrough came during Rosa's second week, when Isabel had one of her increasingly rare nighttime episodes, the kind of panic attack that had become heartbreakingly familiar to Victoria and Richard. They found their daughter in her bathroom at 2 in the morning, sitting on the floor in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to breathe normally. Victoria was reaching for the phone to call Dr. Hendricks when Rosa appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple robe and carrying a small ceramic cup. "May I?" she asked quietly, and something in her tone made Victoria step aside. Rosa sat cross-legged on the bathroom floor beside Isabel, maintaining enough distance to avoid feeling intrusive while staying close enough to offer comfort. She didn't try to touch the child or ask what was wrong. Instead, she began to hum, a low, rhythmic melody that seemed to match the pace of steady breathing. "This is chamomile tea with a little honey," Rosa said softly, setting the cup within Isabel's reach. "My grandmother used to make it for me when the world felt too big and scary. Sometimes it helps to have something warm to hold, even if you don't drink it." Isabel's breathing gradually slowed as she listened to Rosa's humming. After several minutes, she reached for the cup, wrapping her small hands around its warmth without bringing it to her lips. "That's exactly right," Rosa murmured. "Sometimes we just need to know that comfort is there if we want it." Victoria and Richard watched from the doorway as their daughter's panic subsided under Rosa's patient presence. When Isabel finally felt calm enough to return to bed, Rosa helped her settle under the covers and sat in the chair beside her bed until she fell asleep. "How did you know?" Victoria asked as they walked Rosa to her car later that morning. "How did you know exactly what she needed?" Rosa paused beside her Honda, considering the question carefully. "I grew up with a grandmother who believed that healing happens in its own time, in its own way. You can't rush it or force it, but you can create the conditions where it's more likely to happen. That little girl is carrying something heavy, and she's been carrying it alone. I can't take the weight away, but I can sit with her while she figures out how to set it down." As Rosa drove away, Victoria and Richard stood in their driveway, watching the taillights disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. For the first time in months, they felt something that might have been hope, not for a quick fix or a dramatic breakthrough, but for the possibility that healing could happen gradually, gently, in the presence of someone who understood that some wounds needed tenderness rather than pressure to mend. Inside the house, Isabel slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her small hand still curved as if holding an invisible cup of warmth and comfort. By December, the Whitmore house had developed new rhythms around Rosa's quiet presence. The winter light filtering through tall windows seemed warmer somehow, and the oppressive silence that had dominated every room for months began to feel less like a prison and more like a choice that might eventually change. Rosa moved through her daily routines with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that meaningful progress happened in moments too small for outsiders to notice. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when Rosa was preparing Isabel's breakfast. The child had developed a habit of appearing in the kitchen doorway around 8 o'clock, watching Rosa work while maintaining her careful distance. This morning, Rosa was humming Amazing Grace while scrambling eggs, her voice low and melodious as she moved between the stove and counter with practiced efficiency. When Rosa turned to set the plate on the breakfast table, she found a small piece of construction paper placed carefully beside the silverware. On it, drawn in purple crayon, was a simple stick figure with curly hair and a smiling face. Beneath the figure, in Isabel's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Nice Lady." Rosa studied the drawing for a long moment, understanding its significance. This wasn't random artwork, it was deliberate communication. Isabel's first attempt to bridge the gap between her internal world and the external one that had become too frightening to navigate with words. "Well, would you look at that?" Rosa murmured, speaking to the empty kitchen, as if Isabel might still be listening from wherever she'd retreated. "Somebody drew me a picture. That's about the nicest thing that's happened to me in a long while." She carefully propped the drawing against the sugar bowl, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. When Victoria appeared for her morning coffee, she stopped short at seeing Rosa arranging the simple artwork like a centerpiece. Isabel drew that for you?" Victoria's voice carried a mixture of surprise and something that might have been envy. Despite months of patient reading and gentle encouragement, her daughter hadn't offered her so much as a crayon scribble. "She did indeed," Rosa said, refilling Victoria's coffee cup with the careful attention she brought to all her tasks. "Sometimes children talk to us in languages we don't expect. That little girl is saying she feels safe enough to reach out, even if she's not ready for words yet." Victoria stared at the drawing, trying to see beyond the simple lines, to understand what her daughter was attempting to communicate. "What should I do? Should I acknowledge it? Ask her about it?" "I'd leave it be for now," Rosa advised gently. "She'll know you saw it, and she'll know you thought it was important enough to keep displayed. That's conversation enough for today." The drawing remained on the breakfast table for 3 days before Isabel added to it, this time a second figure drawn in yellow crayon, positioned near the first one. When Rosa asked no questions and offered no commentary beyond genuine appreciation, a third figure appeared by the end of the week. Then a fourth. Soon, the single piece of construction paper was filled with a crude but recognizable family scene. 4 stick figures standing beneath a large tree, with what appeared to be a house in the background. Richard discovered the evolving artwork on Friday evening when he came home early from a client dinner, finding Rosa wiping down the kitchen counters while Isabel sat at the breakfast table adding details to her drawing. His daughter looked up when he entered, making brief eye contact before returning to her work with renewed concentration. "That's quite a masterpiece," Richard said, settling into the chair beside Isabel's. He had learned, through painful trial and error, not to overwhelm her with questions or expectations. Instead, he simply observed, letting her control the pace and depth of any interaction. Isabel picked up a brown crayon and began adding what appeared to be roots beneath the tree in her drawing, intricate, spreading lines that connected all the figures to the same foundation. The symbolism wasn't lost on Richard, who recognized his daughter's attempt to illustrate family connections that ran deeper than surface interactions. "Those are some mighty strong roots," Rosa observed from across the kitchen, her voice carrying the warm approval that had become Isabel's most reliable source of encouragement. "Trees with roots like that can weather just about any storm." That weekend, the drawing ritual expanded. Isabel began leaving new pictures in places where Rosa would find them during her daily routines. Simple sketches tucked into the fold of a freshly made bed, propped against cleaning supplies, or placed carefully on Rosa's coat in the front closet. Each drawing seemed to tell part of a story. A house with many windows, a garden with oversized flowers, people holding hands beneath that same spreading tree. Victoria began finding her own pictures, always left in the morning room where she read her emails, always featuring the same yellow stick figure that seemed to represent her. These drawings showed the yellow figure in various activities, reading a book, tending flowers, sometimes standing alone but looking toward the other figures with outstretched arms. "She's trying to tell us something," Victoria said to Richard one evening as they reviewed the growing collection of artwork. "But I can't figure out what it means." Rosa, who had stayed late to help prepare for a dinner party that Victoria ultimately cancelled, offered her perspective with characteristic directness. "Those pictures aren't puzzles to be solved, Mrs. Whitmore. They're invitations to be accepted. That child is asking if it's safe to hope that her family can stay together, if it's safe to trust that love doesn't disappear just because people make mistakes." The observation hit Victoria with unexpected force. For months, she had focused on getting Isabel to speak, treating her daughter's silence as a problem to be fixed rather than communication to be understood. But these drawings suggested that Isabel was talking, constantly, elaborately, in a visual language that asked for patience rather than pressure. "How do I respond to an invitation like that?" Victoria asked. "You accept it," Rosa said simply. "You draw back." The next morning, Victoria left her own drawing beside Isabel's breakfast plate. A simple sketch showing the yellow figure and a smaller purple figure, Isabel's preferred color, holding hands beneath a rainbow. It was crude and childish, nothing like the sophisticated artwork Victoria had studied in college. But it carried a message of acceptance and love that transcended artistic skill. Isabel found the drawing before Rosa called her for breakfast. When she appeared in the kitchen, she was carrying both her own latest creation and Victoria's response, setting them side by side on the table as if comparing conversation partners. For the first time in months, something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. The visual dialogue continued to evolve throughout December. Richard began adding his own contributions, stick figures engaged in activities he and Isabel had enjoyed before the ranch incident. Drawings that showed father and daughter reading together, building puzzles, or simply sitting peacefully in the same space. His artistic skills were even more limited than Victoria's, but his drawings carried emotional honesty that resonated with their intended audience. Rosa watched this silent family conversation unfold with the satisfaction of someone who understood that healing rarely happened in dramatic breakthroughs. More often, it occurred in small gestures repeated over time, in the gradual rebuilding of trust that had been damaged by circumstances too complex for simple explanations. The breakthrough moment came 3 days before Christmas, when Isabel left a drawing that was different from all the others. Instead of stick figures, she'd attempted to draw realistic faces, recognizable portraits of Rosa, Victoria, Richard, and herself. The figures were still crude by adult standards, but they showed an attention to detail that suggested careful observation. Rosa's hair was accurately depicted in its characteristic bun. Victoria's was drawn long and blonde. Richard's showed the grey at his temples, but it was the expression on the smallest figure's face that caught everyone's attention. For the first time in any of her drawings, Isabel had given herself a smile. Not just the curved line that children typically use to indicate happiness, but a careful attempt to show joy, contentment, or at least the possibility of both. Rosa found the drawing that morning and stood in the kitchen for several minutes, studying the small face that looked back at her from the paper. When Isabel appeared for breakfast, Rosa was waiting with a drawing of her own, the first she had contributed to their visual conversation. Her sketch showed the same 4 figures, but this time they were all gathered around a table, with small hearts floating above their heads and what appeared to be steam rising from cups or plates, suggesting warmth and nourishment. At the bottom of the page, in Rosa's careful handwriting, were the words, "Every family needs a safe place to be together." Isabel studied Rosa's drawing for a long time, tracing the hearts with her finger and examining each figure's face, as if memorizing important details. When she finally looked up at Rosa, her blue eyes held a question that didn't need words to be understood. "Yes, sugar," Rosa said gently. "This is your safe place, and we're your safe people. You don't have to earn that or protect it or worry about losing it. It just is." For a moment, Richard thought Isabel might speak. Her lips parted, and she leaned forward slightly as if preparing to share something important. But instead, she reached across the table and placed her small hand over Rosa's larger one, the first physical contact she had initiated with anyone since the ranch incident. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but it spoke volumes about trust rebuilt and safety restored. When Isabel withdrew her hand, she was smiling, not the careful, guarded expression she had worn for months, but something genuine and unguarded that reminded her parents of the child they had feared was lost forever. Outside, December snow began to fall on the Whitmore estate, covering the garden where Isabel had spent so many silent hours in a blanket of pristine white. But inside the warm kitchen, surrounded by drawings that told the story of a family finding its way back to each other, winter felt less like an ending and more like the quiet preparation for spring. Eleanor Whitmore's black Mercedes pulled through the estate gates on a bitter January morning, 6 months after the ranch incident that had changed everything. She had been strategically absent since her confrontation with Richard at the country club, allowing what she termed the situation to stabilize before reasserting her influence. But the holidays had passed without the traditional family gathering at the Greenwich mansion, and rumors were circulating in her social circles about the Whitmore family's continued isolation. Victoria saw the car from the morning room window and felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Eleanor's visits were never casual. They were calculated exercises in control, designed to reinforce family hierarchies and address what the matriarch viewed as unacceptable deviations from Whitmore standards. Today's unannounced arrival suggested that Eleanor had decided 6 months was long enough for her granddaughter's phase to continue. "Richard," Victoria called, her voice carrying the tension that Eleanor's presence always brought to the house. "Your mother is here." Richard appeared in the doorway of his study, his expression immediately hardening. Since their confrontation in November, his relationship with his mother had been strained to the breaking point. He understood now that Eleanor's intervention with Martha Patterson, however well-intentioned, had prioritized family reputation over Isabel's emotional well-being. And that understanding had fundamentally altered his willingness to defer to maternal authority. Eleanor entered the house with her characteristic commanding presence, dressed in a perfectly tailored wool coat and carrying herself with the regal bearing that had intimidated 3 generations of Whitmore family members. At 74, she remained formidable, silver hair styled to perfection, jewelry that spoke of old money rather than new wealth, and the kind of posture that announced her expectation of deference from everyone around her. "Victoria." "Darling," Eleanor said, offering her cheek for the customary air kiss that passed for affection in their family. "You look thin. I hope this unfortunate business hasn't been affecting your health." The casual cruelty of the observation, reducing Isabel's trauma to unfortunate business, set the tone for what promised to be a difficult encounter. Victoria accepted the greeting with practiced grace, but Richard noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she hung up Eleanor's coat. "Mother," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting you today. Obviously not. Or you might have prepared me for what I encountered driving up to the house." Eleanor's tone carried the kind of displeasure that had once made Richard scramble to correct whatever perceived failure had triggered her disapproval. "There's a strange car in the driveway, some sort of domestic vehicle, and I heard singing coming from the kitchen." Singing, Richard, as if this were some sort of boarding house rather than a family estate. Rosa's Honda Civic and her habit of humming while she worked had clearly not met Eleanor's standards for appropriate household management. Victoria felt a protective surge that surprised her with its intensity. Over the past 2 months, Rosa had become more than just domestic help. She had become a source of stability and comfort that the family desperately needed. "The car belongs to our housekeeper," Richard said. "Rosa Johnson. She's been with us since November." "I see." Eleanor's tone suggested that she saw quite a lot, and none of it met with her approval. "And where is Isabel?" "I've come to see my granddaughter." The request sent alarm bells through both parents. Isabel had been making steady progress with Rosa's gentle encouragement, still not speaking, but engaging more actively with her visual communication, occasionally making eye contact and showing signs of the bright, curious child she had been before the ranch incident. Eleanor's demanding presence threatened to undo months of careful healing. "She's in the kitchen with Rosa," Victoria said carefully. "Mother Eleanor, I should mention that Isabel is still adjusting. She may not respond the way you expect." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Victoria, my granddaughter has been indulging in this dramatic silence for 6 months. It's time she learned that such behavior is unacceptable in a family like ours." Children need structure and expectations, not endless coddling that reinforces inappropriate responses to minor difficulties. The description of Isabel's trauma as dramatic silence and minor difficulties revealed everything Richard needed to know about his mother's understanding of the situation. Eleanor viewed her granddaughter's condition as willful misbehavior rather than psychological injury, and her solution would be pressure and shame rather than patience and support. "Mother, I don't think," Richard began, but Eleanor was already moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having her wishes accommodated immediately. They found Rosa and Isabel engaged in one of their quiet morning rituals. Rosa was kneading bread dough while humming "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and Isabel sat at the kitchen table, working on a new drawing, this one showing a garden filled with flowers in impossible colors. The scene radiated peaceful contentment, a stark contrast to the tension that Eleanor's presence brought to every room she entered. "Isabel," Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the kitchen's warm atmosphere like a blade, "come here immediately and greet your grandmother properly." The effect on Isabel was instantaneous and devastating. The child's entire body went rigid, her crayon freezing mid-stroke as her face drained of color. The progress of recent months seemed to evaporate in seconds, replaced by the frozen terror that had characterized her earliest days of silence. Rosa's hands stilled on the bread dough as she assessed the situation with the quick instincts of someone who understood family dynamics and their impact on vulnerable children. She didn't speak, not her place to challenge Eleanor directly, but her presence became a protective shield between Isabel and the demanding voice that had triggered such obvious distress. "Isabel Marie Whitmore," Eleanor continued, her tone growing more authoritative as her granddaughter failed to respond. "I will not tolerate this rude behavior. You will stand up, come here, and speak to me this instant." The command sent Isabel into what could only be described as a panic response. She slid from her chair and backed against the kitchen counter, her blue eyes wide with the kind of fear that spoke to memories too painful for an 8-year-old to process rationally. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and tears began streaming down her cheeks without sound. "That's quite enough," Richard said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him legendary in hostile business negotiations. "Mother, you need to leave now." Eleanor turned to face her son with the kind of imperial displeasure usually reserved for servants who had forgotten their place. "Excuse me, you heard me. You're frightening my daughter, and I won't allow that in my house." Richard moved to position himself between Eleanor and Isabel, his protective instincts finally overriding decades of filial conditioning. "Richard, don't be ridiculous. The child is clearly being allowed to manipulate this entire household with her dramatic episodes. What she needs is firm guidance, not this permissive—" "What she needs," Victoria interrupted, her voice shaking with anger, "is to feel safe in her own home. And your presence is making that impossible." The confrontation was building to a crescendo when Rosa made a decision that went far beyond her role as domestic help. She moved to Isabel's side and gently took the child's trembling hand, speaking in the soft, steady voice that had become Isabel's anchor during months of silent struggle. "Miss Isabel," Rosa said quietly, "remember what we talked about how you get to choose who deserves your words. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is protect our voices from people who aren't ready to hear them properly." It was a direct challenge to Eleanor's authority, delivered with such gentle dignity that even the family matriarch seemed momentarily uncertain how to respond. Rosa continued, her dark eyes meeting Eleanor's with calm defiance. "Mrs. Whitmore, that little girl, has been through more than most adults could handle. She's been healing in her own time, in her own way, and she's made real progress. But healing requires safety, and safety requires that the people around her understand that love doesn't come with conditions." Eleanor's face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being challenged by someone she considered beneath her social station. How dare you speak to me that way? Richard, I insist you dismiss this woman immediately. No. Richard's voice was steady, final. Rosa stays. You leave. The words hung in the kitchen like a declaration of independence. For the first time in his adult life, Richard had chosen his immediate family over his mother's demands. And the shift in power dynamics was seismic. Eleanor gathered herself with the dignity of someone who had never before faced such complete rejection of her authority. Very well, but understand this, Richard. You're making a choice between your mother and this circus you're allowing your household to become. Don't expect me to pretend that everything is normal when you finally come to your senses. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floors with the sharp percussion of wounded pride. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house like the end of an era. In the kitchen, Isabel gradually relaxed as the immediate threat passed. Rosa continued to hold her hand, humming softly until the child's breathing returned to normal. When Victoria knelt beside her daughter's chair, Isabel looked up with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been respect. "Sweetheart," Victoria said gently, "you never have to see anyone who makes you feel scared. Not even family. Your safety matters more than anyone's feelings." Isabel nodded slowly, then picked up her purple crayon and added something to her drawing, a small figure standing protectively in front of a larger one, with a heart floating between them. When she finished, she carefully tore off a corner of the paper and handed it to Rosa. On the small piece was a single word, written in Isabel's careful handwriting, "Friend." Rosa accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding that she had been given something precious, not just a child's trust, but a family's recognition that some boundaries were worth defending, regardless of the cost. Outside, Eleanor's Mercedes disappeared through the estate gates, carrying with it the last vestiges of a family dynamic built on control rather than love. Inside the warm kitchen, 3 adults and 1 silent child began the work of building something better, something based on protection rather than performance, healing rather than hierarchy. It would be months before Isabel spoke her first words, but on this January morning, surrounded by people who had chosen her well-being over social expectations, she took the most important step of all. She began to believe that her voice, when it returned, would be welcomed rather than judged. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of possibility that seemed to permeate every corner of the Whitmore estate. The garden, where Isabel had spent so many silent hours, was coming alive with daffodils and crocuses, their bright faces turning toward the warming sun as if celebrating their emergence from winter's long darkness. Inside the house, something similar was happening, a gradual awakening that had taken 8 months to unfold. Rosa stood at the kitchen counter on a warm April afternoon, preparing what had become known as her miracle cornbread, a recipe passed down from her grandmother that somehow managed to fill the entire house with the scent of home and comfort. The smell of baking cornbread had become one of Isabel's favorite things about their daily routine, though she had never actually tasted it. Instead, she would appear in the kitchen doorway whenever the timer went off, breathing in the warm, sweet aroma with the kind of reverence usually reserved for precious gifts. Today felt different somehow. Victoria had enrolled in her first art class in 15 years, a watercolor workshop at the Greenwich Arts Council that met twice a week and left paint stains on her fingers that she wore like badges of courage. Richard had begun working from home 3 days a week, transforming the small study off the kitchen into a secondary office where he could be present for the family rhythms that he was finally learning to value above quarterly profit reports. "Miss Isabel," Rosa called softly toward the breakfast nook where the child sat working on her latest artistic creation. "Would you mind helping me with something? I can't quite reach the honey jar on the top shelf." It was a gentle fiction. Rosa was perfectly capable of reaching the honey herself, but she had learned that Isabel responded well to requests for assistance. Being needed gave the child a sense of purpose that seemed to strengthen her connection to the household's daily life. Isabel looked up from her drawing and nodded, sliding from her chair with the careful grace she had developed during her months of observed silence. She had grown taller since the ranch incident, her 8-year-old frame showing the first signs of the young woman she would become. But her movements still carried the cautious quality of someone who had learned to navigate the world without making unnecessary noise. As Isabel stretched to reach the honey jar, Rosa noticed something different in her expression, a lightness that had been absent for so long it seemed almost miraculous. The child's blue eyes held a spark of something that might have been mischief, and when she handed Rosa the honey, she lingered in the kitchen instead of retreating to her usual safe distance. "Thank you." "Sugar?" Rosa said, using the endearment that had become her standard address for Isabel. "You know, this cornbread is going to be extra special today. I added a little something my grandmother taught me, a pinch of love and a prayer for good things to come." Isabel tilted her head, studying Rosa's face with the intense attention she brought to everything the housekeeper said. Slowly, she pointed to the oven where the cornbread was baking, and then to herself, then back to Rosa. The gesture was clear. She wanted to be part of this ritual that had become so central to their daily life. "You want to help?" Rosa asked, understanding immediately. "Well, of course you can help. Every good cook needs an assistant." Rosa opened the oven door, releasing a wave of golden-scented steam that made Isabel's eyes close in appreciation. The cornbread was perfectly done, golden brown on top with edges that had pulled slightly away from the pan, exactly the way Rosa's grandmother had taught her to recognize perfection. "Now," Rosa said, setting the hot pan on a cooling rack, "the most important part comes next. We have to wait for it to cool just enough to cut, but not so long that it gets cold. That's the secret to perfect cornbread. Timing." Isabel nodded solemnly, as if Rosa were sharing state secrets rather than baking tips. She positioned herself beside the cooling rack like a guardian, watching the cornbread with the focused attention of someone who understood that important things required patience. It was then that Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway. Having heard Rosa's voice and been drawn by the familiar scent that had come to represent the peace his family had found under her care, he stopped short when he saw Isabel standing so close to Rosa, participating in the afternoon ritual with an engagement he hadn't seen in months. "Something smells incredible in here," Richard said, keeping his voice low to avoid disrupting the peaceful scene. Rosa smiled, gesturing toward Isabel with obvious pride. "Miss Isabel has been helping me today. She's got excellent timing, knew exactly when that cornbread was ready to come out." The praise brought a flush of pleasure to Isabel's cheeks, and she looked up at her father with something that might have been the beginning of the smile she had once shared so freely. Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized this small sign of his daughter's returning confidence. "I can tell," Richard said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with the careful casualness he had learned to employ around his daughter. "The best cornbread always comes from teamwork." Rosa checked the cornbread's temperature with an experienced finger, then nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect timing. Miss Isabel, would you like to do the honors?" She handed Isabel a butter knife, guiding her small hands as they cut the first piece of cornbread. Steam rose from the golden interior, and the child's eyes widened with wonder at the simple magic of creating something beautiful and nourishing from basic ingredients. "Go on," Rosa encouraged gently. "Take the first bite. You earned it." Isabel looked at the piece of cornbread in her hands, then up at Rosa, then at her father. For a moment, Richard thought she might speak. Her lips parted slightly, and she leaned forward as if preparing to share something important. But instead, she took a careful bite of the warm cornbread, and her expression transformed into something that could only be described as pure joy. The taste seemed to unlock something in her. Memories of comfort and safety, Perhaps, or simply the pleasure of experiencing something wonderful after months of emotional numbness. She looked up at Rosa with eyes bright with tears, and this time Richard was certain she was about to speak. "Rosa," Isabel whispered, her voice so quiet that both adults had to lean forward to hear her. "It tastes like hugs." The words hung in the kitchen like a benediction. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, and Richard felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. After 8 months of silence, his daughter had chosen to speak, not to doctors or therapists or family members demanding answers, but to the woman who had earned her trust through patience and unconditional acceptance. "Oh, sugar," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said about my cornbread." Isabel took another bite, savoring both the taste and the moment of connection. Then, looking directly at her father, she whispered again, "Daddy, I was scared you wouldn't love me anymore if I told you what I saw." Richard's world tilted on its axis. He moved slowly, carefully, lowering himself to his daughter's eye level without crowding her or making sudden movements that might frighten her back into silence. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with tears he was trying not to shed. "There is nothing you could see, nothing you could say, nothing you could do that would ever make me stop loving you. Nothing. Do you understand?" Isabel nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as 8 months of held fear began to release. "I thought Mommy was going to leave. I thought if I talked about it, it would make it happen faster." "Oh, baby girl," Richard breathed, reaching out slowly to touch his daughter's face. When she didn't pull away, he gently wiped her tears with his thumb. "Mommy and I had some things to figure out, but we never ever would have left you. You are the most important thing in our whole world." "I was trying to keep us together," Isabel whispered, "by not talking about the bad things." "You don't have to keep us together, sweetheart. That's our job. Your job is to be 8 years old and tell us when you're scared or confused or need help. Can you do that?" Isabel nodded again, then surprised both adults by stepping forward and wrapping her small arms around her father's neck. Richard held her carefully, feeling the tension that had defined their family for 8 months finally beginning to dissolve. "Rosa," Isabel said, her voice muffled against Richard's shoulder, but audible enough to be understood. "Can we make more cornbread tomorrow? I want to help again." "Sugar," Rosa said, tears flowing freely now. "We can make cornbread every day if you want to. And maybe you can teach your mama how to help too." The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating 3 people who had found each other through patient love and the simple magic of shared comfort. Outside, spring was in full bloom, but inside the warm kitchen, something even more precious was flowering, a family learning to trust each other with their broken places, knowing that healing happened one word, one moment, one perfect piece of cornbread at a time. When Victoria came home from her art class an hour later, paint still fresh under her fingernails and a new lightness in her step, she found her family in the kitchen sharing cornbread and conversation. The sound of Isabel's voice, tentative but real, brought her to tears of joy and relief. "Mommy," Isabel said, looking up from her second piece of cornbread, "Rosa taught me how to cook. Do you want to learn too?" Victoria's answer was wordless. She simply knelt beside her daughter's chair and held her close, breathing in the scent of cornbread and the even sweeter smell of her child's returned voice. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had refused to give up on them, the Whitmore family began the final phase of their journey back to each other. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, carried in Rosa's weathered hands like something precious and fragile. The return address bore Eleanor Whitmore's elegant script, but the careful way Rosa presented it to Richard and Victoria suggested she understood its potential significance. 9 months had passed since Eleanor's dramatic exit from their lives. 9 months of healing and rebuilding that had transformed the Whitmore house from a monument to silent suffering into something that actually felt like home. "Isabel, now speaking regularly, though still preferring whispered conversations and careful observations to the chatter of her peers. Sat at the breakfast table working on a new drawing. Her artistic skills had blossomed alongside her returning voice, and this morning's creation showed the garden in full summer bloom. Roses and peonies rendered in brilliant watercolors that Victoria had taught her to use during their shared art sessions. "What does she want?" Victoria asked, studying the envelope as if it might contain something dangerous. Eleanor's absence had been both a relief and a source of anxiety. Her mother-in-law was not someone who simply disappeared without a larger strategy in mind. Richard opened the letter with careful deliberation, his businessman's instincts preparing him for manipulation disguised as family concern. But as he read Eleanor's carefully crafted words, his expression shifted from wariness to something approaching surprise. "She wants to apologize," he said finally, looking up at Victoria with obvious confusion. To Isabel specifically. "She says she's been reflecting on her behavior and realizes she may have contributed to our daughter's distress." Victoria nearly choked on her coffee. "Eleanor Whitmore wants to apologize? To an 8-year-old? Listen to this," Richard continued, reading from the letter. "I have spent these months consulting with child psychologists to better understand trauma responses in children. I realize now that my expectations and demands were not only inappropriate, but potentially harmful. I would like the opportunity to make amends, if Isabel feels comfortable receiving an apology." Rosa, who had been quietly arranging fresh flowers in a vase nearby, looked up with the kind of knowing expression that suggested she had anticipated this development. "People can change, Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. "Even people who've been set in their ways for 74 years. Sometimes watching a family nearly break apart is what it takes to understand what really matters." Isabel had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus she brought to all adult discussions, her blue eyes moving between her parents as they processed her grandmother's unexpected request. When Rosa spoke about change and understanding, Isabel set down her paintbrush and looked directly at her father. "Daddy," she said, her voice still soft but growing stronger each day, "what does apologize mean?" Richard moved to sit beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. "It means admitting when you've done something wrong and promising to try to do better. It means saying you're sorry and meaning it. Even grown-ups have to apologize." "Especially grown-ups," Victoria said, joining them at the table. "Adults make mistakes too, sweetheart. Sometimes big ones. And when we hurt someone we love, we need to say we're sorry and try to fix it." Isabel considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all new concepts. "Is grandmother sorry for making me scared?" The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Richard looked at the letter again, noting details he had missed in his initial reading. Eleanor's handwriting, usually so controlled and precise, showed slight tremors that spoke of genuine emotion. Her word choices, typically formal and distant, carried an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "She says she is," Richard replied honestly. "But the important thing is how you feel about it. You don't have to see her if you don't want to. You don't have to forgive her just because she apologizes. You get to decide what feels safe and right for you." This was perhaps the most important lesson Isabel had learned during her months of healing. That her feelings mattered, that her comfort was a priority, that she had the right to set boundaries, even with family members who believed they deserved automatic access to her love and attention. "Can I think about it?" Isabel asked. "Of course, sugar," Rosa said, returning to her flower arrangement with movements that somehow conveyed both support and distance, giving the family space to make their decision without pressure from outside opinions. Over the following week, Isabel considered the question with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to weigh decisions against their potential emotional cost. She drew pictures that seemed to explore the concept of forgiveness, images of broken objects being mended, gardens growing back after storms, animals comforting each other after conflicts. During one of their evening talks, as Richard read aloud from The Secret Garden, a book that had taken on special significance during their own process of cultivating growth from damaged soil, Isabel interrupted with a question that revealed the depth of her understanding. "Daddy, if grandmother says sorry, but then acts mean again, does the sorry stop working?" The question demonstrated how much Isabel had learned about the difference between words and actions, between promises and follow-through. Richard set down the book and gave her his full attention. "That's a very smart question, sweetheart. A real apology includes changing your behavior, not just saying words. If someone keeps hurting you the same way after they apologize, then the apology wasn't real. So I can try believing her. But if she makes me scared again, I can change my mind." "Absolutely. You can always change your mind about feeling safe. That's your right, and we'll always protect that right." A week later, Isabel announced her decision during one of Rosa's cornbread afternoons. She had been helping measure ingredients, her small hands carefully pouring milk while Rosa guided her movements with patient attention. "I want to see grandmother," Isabel said suddenly, as if the decision had crystallized in the act of creating something nourishing. "But not in our house. Somewhere else. Somewhere I can leave if I need to." Victoria and Richard exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both recognizing the wisdom in her conditions. Isabel was learning to trust her own instincts while also building in safety measures, a skill that would serve her well beyond this particular situation. They arranged to meet Eleanor at the Greenwich Botanical Gardens, a public space where Isabel felt comfortable and which offered multiple paths for departure if the encounter became overwhelming. Rosa, understanding her role in Isabel's support system, volunteered to accompany them and wait nearby, close enough to provide comfort if needed, distant enough to allow privacy for family reconciliation. Eleanor arrived early, waiting on a bench beside the rose garden with the kind of nervous energy Richard had never seen in his mother before. At 74, she remained elegant and commanding, but something in her posture suggested vulnerability that age and reflection had finally allowed her to acknowledge. When she saw Isabel approaching hand in hand with Victoria, Eleanor's composure nearly broke. The child who had been silent and terrified 9 months earlier now walked with quiet confidence, her artistic eye taking in the garden's beauty with obvious appreciation. She had grown taller, her face had lost the pinched anxiety that had defined her during the worst months, and most remarkably, she made direct eye contact as they approached. "Hello, grandmother," Isabel said when they reached the bench, her voice clear and steady despite its continued softness. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at hearing her granddaughter's voice for the first time since the ranch incident. "Hello, my dear one," she replied, her own voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." What followed was perhaps the most honest conversation Eleanor Whitmore had ever had with a family member. She spoke directly to Isabel, acknowledging her mistakes without excuse or justification, explaining that she had been wrong to demand speech and compliance instead of offering patience and understanding. "I was so focused on how our family appeared to other people," Eleanor said, "that I forgot what our family needed to actually be healthy and happy. That was wrong of me, and I'm truly sorry." Isabel listened with the careful attention she brought to all important conversations, occasionally asking questions that revealed her growing understanding of complex emotional dynamics. When Eleanor finished her apology, Isabel was quiet for several minutes, studying her grandmother's face as if assessing the sincerity of her words. "Grandmother," Isabel finally said, "when I was scared to talk, everyone wanted me to be different. But Rosa and Mommy and Daddy learned to love me even when I was quiet. Can you love me even if I'm different from what you expected?" The question struck Eleanor with the force of absolute truth. Her granddaughter was asking for unconditional love, not performance-based approval, not compliance with family expectations, but acceptance of who she actually was rather than who others needed her to be. "Yes," Eleanor said, tears flowing freely now. I can learn to do that. I want to learn to do that. The conversation continued for another hour, with Isabel gradually relaxing as she recognized genuine change in her grandmother's approach. Eleanor asked about her drawings, her friendship with Rosa, her art lessons with Victoria, showing interest in Isabel's actual life rather than demanding conformity to predetermined roles. When they finally parted, Isabel surprised everyone by initiating a gentle hug with her grandmother. It was brief and careful, but it represented a bridge rebuilt rather than simply repaired. "She can visit sometimes," Isabel announced as they walked back to the car. "But if she forgets how to be kind, I'll remind her. And if she doesn't listen, then the visits stop." Rosa, who had observed the entire encounter from a respectful distance, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who understood that healing happened in layers, with setbacks and breakthroughs occurring in equal measure. "That sounds like a very wise plan, Miss Isabel," she said. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Connecticut landscape in brilliant oranges and reds, the Whitmore family hosted their first holiday gathering since the ranch incident. Eleanor came, but as a guest rather than the commanding presence she had once been. She brought art supplies for Isabel and spent the afternoon learning watercolor techniques from both granddaughter and daughter-in-law. Victoria had enrolled in the Yale graduate program she had once thought impossible, pursuing her dreams while maintaining her family relationships through careful balance and honest communication. Richard had restructured his business to prioritize presence over pure profit, discovering that success meant different things than he had been taught to believe. Rosa had brought her teenage daughter Maya from Georgia to study at Greenwich Academy, and the 2 generations of Southern wisdom had added new dimensions of warmth and laughter to the estate's daily rhythms. Maya and Isabel had become unlikely friends, despite their age difference, bonding over art projects and Rosa's legendary cornbread. On Christmas afternoon, as snow fell softly outside the morning room windows, Isabel sat surrounded by family reading aloud from a story she had written herself, a tale about a little girl who lost her voice but found her strength, and the adults who learned to listen with their hearts instead of their expectations. Her voice, once lost to trauma and fear, now carried notes of confidence and joy that filled the house with something more valuable than all the wealth and status the Whitmore name had accumulated over generations. It carried love freely given and gratefully received, forgiveness earned through changed behavior, and the understanding that families weren't perfect collections of individuals performing predetermined roles, but imperfect groups of people learning to care for each other's broken places. In the gentle twilight of Christmas evening, surrounded by the people who had refused to give up on her, Isabel Whitmore spoke her truth in a voice that would never again be silenced by fear, and found that her words created exactly the kind of magic she had always known was possible, when love was patient enough to wait for the right moment to bloom. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched until here, comment "I watched until here" and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting for you.